In the heart of Victoria Island, where skyscrapers touch the clouds and the streets never truly slept, stood Harbor View Bistro, one of Lagos's most prestigious restaurants. The glass walls shimmered like mirrors, and every evening, luxury cars lined the front. Inside, well-dressed elites sipped wine and dined on imported delicacies. The man behind this empire was Mr. Charles Benson, a man known more for his quiet demeanor than his wealth. Tall, well-kept, and always dressed in custom-fitted suits, Mr. Benson moved like a shadow, calm, observant, and unapproachable. Among his team of over 60 staff members was a quiet woman named Grace Johnson. Most barely noticed her. She cleaned the marble floors and polished the glass windows. Her uniform hung loosely on her slim frame, her shoes were worn, and her presence was like background noise seen but never truly acknowledged. Every night, long after the customers had gone and the lights were dimmed, Grace would approach the kitchen staff. "Please, if there are any leftovers," she'd ask politely, never begging, never demanding. One late night, Mr. Benson stayed behind to finalize some paperwork. As he stepped into the quiet car park, he saw her Grace standing near his sleek black BMW, her hands folded in front of her, eyes fixed on the ground. "Excuse me," he called out. She jumped slightly and turned. "Sir, I'm sorry. I was just waiting." "Waiting for what?" he asked. After a long pause, she whispered, "I was hoping to take some leftover food home, if there's any." Mr. Benson blinked, taken aback. In a restaurant where plates went untouched, she was asking for scraps. That moment planted a question in his chest that refused to leave. Mr. Benson didn't drive off immediately. Instead, he stood by his car, watching as Grace disappeared into the building. He stared at the restaurant, thinking about her cracked shoes, her soft voice. "Leftovers," he murmured. "Not money, not a favor. Just food." Curiosity pulled at him like a tide. 10 minutes later, he watched her emerge with 2 small plastic bags and quietly walk down the road. Something in him stirred. Without hesitation, he slipped behind the wheel and followed her at a safe distance. Grace boarded a rusty Danfo bus heading toward Ajegunle. The bus creaked and groaned through potholed roads and dimly lit streets. Mr. Benson's BMW looked out of place in those parts, but he stayed far enough not to be noticed. After nearly 45 minutes, the bus stopped. Grace stepped off and began walking down a narrow dirt path, her pace quick, her shoulders hunched. He parked near an uncompleted building and followed her discreetly. She turned into a compound that barely passed as a residence, a single-room shack with holes in the roof, walls darkened by years of neglect. As she pushed aside the curtain acting as a door, 2 small voices rang out, "Mommy!" 2 girls, not older than 6 and 8, ran into her arms. Mr. Benson watched from the shadows as Grace handed them the food. She cut the rice and meat into equal portions, sat on the cold floor, and watched them eat. She didn't touch the food. She just smiled. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Mr. Benson felt his chest tighten. The woman he dismissed as just staff suddenly became someone else entirely, a mother feeding on hope. As the girls devoured the meal, Grace gently wiped their mouths with the edge of her wrapper. She tucked them under a thin blanket and hummed a lullaby. Mr. Benson remained outside, hidden but unable to move. Through the cracks in the wooden wall, he saw Grace kneel in prayer. "God, I don't want riches," she whispered. "Just let me keep them safe. Let me have enough to feed them tomorrow." That simple plea hit him harder than any business negotiation he had ever faced. He eventually returned to his car, sat quietly, and stared at his steering wheel. His wealth, his imported furniture, fine wines, tailored suits suddenly felt hollow. That night he didn't sleep. He tossed on his king-size bed, haunted by the image of a woman who gave everything and ate nothing. Why would she never ask for more, he wondered. Why did no one notice her pain? The next morning, he arrived at Harbor View Bistro earlier than usual. As the staff lined up for the morning briefing, he scanned their faces. They all wore the same uniform, but not the same story. He called in his HR manager. "How well do we pay the cleaning staff?" he asked. "The standard minimum, sir," the manager replied. Mr. Benson leaned forward. "Effective immediately, raise their salary. no more minimums, and set up a staff welfare account. Anyone going through hardship must have support. He wasn't doing it out of guilt. He was doing it because Grace had made him see sometimes the quietest workers are the strongest souls. Grace was cleaning the corridor near the CEO's office when the call came. "Mr. Benson wants to see you," said the receptionist. Her heart dropped. Had she done something wrong? Hands slightly trembling, she knocked on his office door. "Come in," came his deep voice. She stepped inside and stood quietly. "Sit," he said, his tone surprisingly gentle. Grace sat, her eyes downcast. "I followed you home last week," he began. Grace's head snapped up. "Sir? I didn't mean to scare you," he continued. "I just needed to understand something." She sat frozen. "I saw your girls, I saw your home, and I saw how you gave them food without eating any yourself." Her lips quivered. She opened her mouth, then closed it. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she whispered. "I just wanted them to eat." Mr. Benson leaned forward. "You caused no trouble. You've done more with scraps than most people do with salaries." He slid an envelope across the table. Grace stared at it, confused. "That's your promotion letter. You're no longer part of the cleaning team. You'll work as my administrative assistant. Better pay, better hours." She covered her mouth, eyes flooding. "But why me?" "Because you showed me what strength looks like," he said, "and I want to be part of your solution, not your silence." The next morning, Grace walked into the restaurant not in her cleaner's uniform, but in a navy blue skirt and white blouse. Her natural hair was neatly packed, her shoes no longer cracked. Staff turned and stared. "Is that Grace?" someone whispered. "What happened?" another asked, but Grace walked past them with quiet dignity. She wasn't arrogant, just focused. On the second floor, right next to Mr. Benson's office, a new desk had been placed. A nameplate read, "Grace Johnson, Administrative Assistant." It felt surreal. She sat at her new desk, straightened the files, and logged into the desktop computer. It was her first time using one. Her palms were sweaty, but her resolve was strong. She would learn, she would grow, and she would never return to that shack in Ajegunle. That evening, she didn't need to wait at the kitchen door for scraps. A delivery van from the restaurant was already parked outside her new apartment, carrying a month's worth of groceries. The girls ran out, screaming with joy. Grace stood in the doorway, tears in her eyes, watching them dance around a basket of yams and cartons of milk. "Mummy, are we rich now?" one asked. Grace pulled them close. "We're not rich," she whispered, "but we're finally safe." Word spread like wildfire. "The cleaner that became the CEO's assistant?" Staff whispered in corners. But instead of bitterness, most felt inspired. Grace didn't act above anyone. She still greeted the cleaners by name, joined the staff lunch queue, and smiled at every face she passed. Her humility disarmed even the harshest skeptics. Mr. Benson noticed something. 2 more workers started arriving early. They took pride in their roles. Something about seeing Grace rise gave them permission to believe in more. One day during a weekly team meeting, Mr. Benson shared the story. "Grace reminded me of something I forgot," he said. "That real strength often hides in silence." Applause erupted. Grace, sitting at the front, lowered her head modestly. After the meeting, a new girl named Clara approached her. "I used to think dreams were for the rich," she said, "but you've made me want to try." Grace smiled, gently squeezed her hand. "Your story can change too. Just keep walking, even when no one's clapping yet." That was Grace's gift. She didn't just survive her pain. She turned it into light for others. A month later, Mr. Benson arranged for a quiet housewarming at Grace's new home in Surulere. It was a modest 2-bedroom flat, painted white with light blue curtains fluttering through the open windows. Inside were soft beds, a working fridge, and a small shelf filled with children's books. It wasn't a mansion, but it was more than Grace ever dreamed of. When Mr. Benson arrived that afternoon with a surprise gift, a full scholarship package for her daughters, Grace collapsed into his arms, weeping. "You're not just helping me," she whispered. "You're rewriting our family story." He nodded quietly. That's the goal. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the girls had fallen asleep, Grace sat alone in her new kitchen. She looked around, then reached for a small notebook. On the front, she wrote in careful letters, "The journey begins here." It was time to record every lesson, every step. Not just for herself, but for every woman who would one day ask, "Can I survive this too?" One morning, as she prepared for work, Grace received an unexpected knock at the door. It was Mrs. Agnes, her former landlady from Ajegunle. "I heard what happened," she said, smiling shyly. "You did well, Grace." Grace invited her in. They sat on clean chairs, sipping tea. "You used to carry food in black nylon," Agnes said. "Now you host guests with ceramic cups." They laughed quietly. Then Agnes said something that stayed with Grace. "Sometimes God hides queens in dust until it's time." That evening, Grace wrote the words down in her notebook. She'd been covered in dust once, but now she saw her reflection again. The woman in the mirror wasn't just a cleaner. She was a provider, a survivor, and finally, a leader. Back at work, Mr. Benson noticed the difference in her eyes. "You're lighter now," he said. "You're healing." Grace nodded. "Yes, for the first time, I'm not just surviving, I'm living." Grace's influence continued to grow not from position or pay, but from authenticity. Staff came to her for advice, for encouragement, even for help writing CVs or Mr. Benson eventually asked her to lead a new internal program called Rise Within, designed to mentor junior staff on growth beyond the job. Every Friday, Grace gathered the staff cleaners, waiters, security guards, and shared lessons from her journey. "No matter what uniform you wear," she would say, "you deserve dignity." Stories were shared, tears were shed, and slowly a culture of care replaced the old hierarchy of fear. One day, a journalist dining at the restaurant overheard one of these sessions. Fascinated, she pitched a feature article titled, "The Cleaner Who Rose." The piece went viral. Grace's story inspired thousands. Offers came in from NGOs. She even received an invitation to speak at a women's leadership conference. But she stayed grounded. "I'm just someone who got seen at the right time," she said. "Now it's my turn to see others." Years later, Grace sat in the audience at her daughter's high school graduation. The head girl giving the valedictory speech was her child, her once hungry, barefoot child. "Everything I am," the girl said through tears, "I owe to my mother. She gave us her strength when she had nothing else left to give." Grace wept silently, her hands clutched around a tiny handkerchief. Mr. Benson, now semi-retired, sat 2 rows behind. He smiled proudly. After the ceremony, he approached her. "You did it," he said. Grace turned to him, eyes glistening. "No, we did it," he nodded. "The day you asked for leftovers changed my life too." Back home that evening, Grace opened her notebook again. Now nearly full, she flipped to the last page and wrote, "The cleaner became more than her title. She became the proof that pain doesn't erase potential. It only delays it." As the sun set over Lagos, casting golden rays on the balcony of her modest home, Grace sat in peace. She had risen not through luck, but through love, persistence, and one man's decision to see her. Moral: never underestimate the silent ones. Sometimes the people we overlook carry the strongest hearts. If you have power, use it to lift others. Grace didn't need saving, she needed someone to believe in her. And when that happened, she became unstoppable. What's your take on Grace's journey? Did her story touch you or remind you of someone you know? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next powerful story coming your way. Your support keeps these stories alive.